I was really interested in learning how potentially you could actually use other methods to analyse players and sometimes extract some of the subjectivity, because we're all fans. At heart, anyone involved in sport, they're involved in it because they love it. And it's quite easy for anyone, even the most logical person or logical thinker, to suddenly get wrapped up in the emotion.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Donald, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking me on, Hussein. I'm really excited to chat to you, and I love what you're doing with the podcast. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Thank you so much. And I'm super excited because not only are you the first sort of sports specific academic to come and a researcher to come and speak to us, but you have a sort of interesting professional experience as well.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'd say I wouldn't probably put myself on the level of some of the guests you've had. I think you've had some real experts who've had long, successful careers in research. I think I'm very much an early researcher, but my background is very applied, and I was the head of performance analysis and technical scouting at Leicester City, Norwich City, and Coventry City. So I worked in professional football for over 10 years. So I think I've got a lot of applied experience, and I'm very much learning, but I've got a real passion for developing other people. And I think that's what drew me to academia. And I think settings like this are fantastic for engaging people to mix that applied side and research. And I think that's when you get some really interesting collaborations.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most amazing things that stood out to me about, I mean, besides the fact that I love football and so do many people listening, but one of the things that really stood out to me is you've sort of married two ideas that I'm incredibly interested in, which is machine learning and artificial intelligence, and player development, and this is and sort of watching how players' careers or predicting essentially how players' careers could go. How did you? Well, when did you first get immersed into this sort of concept of using machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think it's something that, like I mentioned previously, it's been probably over 10 years in the making, really. And I think that I got involved in professional football probably mid 2000s, around 2004, 2005. I'd had some sort of introductory experience as a student before that, but I got kind of thrown in at the deep end, really, at Leicester City, quite an early age when an opportunity came up. And I think I got a huge eye opener to the realities of professional football, the pressures, what goes on behind the scenes, and obviously how important recruitment was. And I think that something I could see, the introduction of transfer windows, the kind of escalation of the money involved in football, it meant things had started to change quite rapidly, and it was becoming a big business. I mean, it had been since the inception of the Premier League, really, but I could see things from behind the scene being a kind of probably more logical process type person, where I was looking at and thinking that clubs had kind of underappreciated their scouting staff. They'd underappreciated what needed to be in place to scout players effectively. And there was a huge explosion of data and video technology. Because around that time, obviously, things like YouTube, etc., the ability to stream video or capture video around the world, and then extract information from it was just kind of really blossoming then. So I think over that sort of 5-10 year period following that, I was really interested in learning how potentially you could actually use other methods to analyze players and sometimes extract some of the subjectivity, because we're all fans. At heart, anyone involved in sport, they're involved in it because they love it, and it's quite easy for anyone, even the most logical person or logical thinker, to suddenly get wrapped up in the emotion.
Mhm.
And transfer windows and games, everything, they all fall down to small moments when actually there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of expectation, and sometimes decisions or science can tell you and logic can tell you that decisions are not always made or the best decisions are not always made in those kind of scenarios. So
Mhm.
you need to kind of create some sort of fallback and process that you refer back to try and bring you back to some sort of logical way of thinking and making decisions. And I think that over those probably 15 years since then, I've been really interested, and it's kind of just snowballed gradually as more and more has been put out there in the media and more research, etc., has been made accessible.
How much pressure has money put on sort of being able to use a logical approach as opposed to an emotional one, or one that's just based on past experience?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's huge pressure on every decision, especially in football, because it is genuine, as you see from the reaction to the Super League announcement recently, that it's a worldwide sport, and people have got really strong associations with it. We are all invested with, everyone who watches the sport, as a fan, you've got a team that you've grown up with, etc. And that means that any decision in the game, especially when you're in the professional level, is heightened. But I think to some extent it means there's an opportunity to use other methods and for people to think slightly differently about the game.
Mm,
And I think that you can never remove the human element. I think that's something that people are the core of everything. Every sort of fantastic thing that has been done before, or achievement, or idea, comes from people, and it comes from people working together usually.
mm,
But it also comes from people from different backgrounds, and I think the more objective elements can help try and review our like preconceived ideas that we all have about things, especially football. And I think they can be really powerful, and it's an opportunity to me, I'd say. But there are, from my own experience, I know there's huge pressure on transfer windows or on the preparation for transfer windows, which is what my research was kind of focusing on. Um, and I think it's probably difficult for people to understand unless they've experienced that.
yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting in particular um, because of the fact that in scouting, an individual coach, the point that you made is that it's a collaborative effort. It's not machines will replace the job of a scout, or a scout can do better than a machine without any sort of technical input. Um, but the really interesting thing for me is that on an individual level, each scout is definitely subject to some cognitive biases that's gonna sort of affect his or her decision when looking at a player, when scouting a player.
Yeah, I think definitely, and I think I admit it myself that there's things that we've all got our own sort of path or our own experiences, and we've learned from different coaches, or we've supported different teams. We've got a vision in our head almost of what we think the game is, or what we think the perfect fullback is, or the perfect centre forward. But until you see a team like Manchester City or Barcelona that's coached by Guardiola, the number nine for him is completely different. You look at his teams, and I would never imagine some of the players playing the positions or the way that they have for him. But he has got a different brain and a different way of looking at the game completely. And it's not based on data, but I think that was something I was, when I was the head of technical scouting at Norwich, we had a variety of scouts with different backgrounds, which I thought was really useful. Some had been ex-players, some had played, quite a long time ago. Some were more recent ex-players, some were from more academic backgrounds, some were a mix of coaching, but they all had a blueprint of what they thought football should be,
Mm.
and they'd lean into that sometimes of their biases on players that they liked or they didn't like. And some of what we were trying to do is explain, well, we understand what you like. This is what the manager or the club is looking for. And this is our profile, and trying to be really specific on that to try and get some consistency. So, and it's like an assessment in a university. It's trying to get students to understand, well, what are you aiming for? Because you might think the best practices X, Y, or Z. But if we're asking for A, B, and C, there's going to be a mismatch in your outcome from your
Yeah.
perception,
Yeah.
and um, that happens in football as well. And I think that's where there needs to be a lot of discussion and kind of real clear guidelines on what we're looking for, and trying to get people to explain, well, why do you think something about a player or a
Mm.
performance, so that we can reflect back on it and look at it and go, are we in agreement, or have we learned something new from you watching that player that we didn't know before?
So talk the audience through some of the audience might not be familiar with it. So talk us through what the scouting process looks like as you experienced it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different layers. I think, if you're going on a preparation for, say, a series of matches, because at the top level now, the clubs and then the international teams as well, they've got a wide range of staff and tools and data and video available to try and monitor players. And effectively, what they're trying to do is monitor people over a longer period of time to get a really accurate picture of the kind of strengths and weaknesses of that player, um, how they tend to play, what they tend to do in different situations, playing in different formations or against different opponents, or what their best performance looks like, how consistent they are. But teams will have some central staff, and they'll have various job titles, but a head of recruitment, a chief scout, head of technical scouting or recruitment analysis. And usually between these staff, what they'll do is they're trying to create profiles of players for each position that fit the club or the manager's philosophy, the head coach's philosophy. Um, and they try to drill down into that in possession, out of possession, and looking at like physically, technically, tactically, in terms of personality and their kind of social preferences, how might they gel with the group. But then looking out there using their network, their own experience, their knowledge, the data around all those elements, and trying to narrow down. Well, we only have so many scouts or so much staff available, or so many hours in the week to watch video, to watch live games, and also to do background research, contact people, understand what the availability of a player is, the contract, potentially the financial outlay on their own, match that against their own kind of squad and succession planning. So they've got to kind of prioritize their time, and they're going to use those resources to try and monitor the most kind of viable players for them, and constantly update shortlists on who they think the best players are at certain age groups and categories, um, and review that on a fairly regular basis, and have collective meetings to kind of break that down with our scouts and the senior staff, um, and then obviously leading into making decisions well in advance of a transfer and on priorities, because it's something I think in Germany they do very well, and in other countries where they pre-plan, and they're making signings before transfer windows open, or getting a long way down the line. They can't officially register the players, but they can negotiate and try and preempt signings rather than wait till the last minute.
Uh,
Unfortunately, just the nature of transfers is a lot of them do happen at the last minute because that's the deadline.
yeah, and I think you've raised a really interesting issue that I think about a lot when I look at football. I mean I played as a holding midfielder, and so naturally I have a bias towards holding midfielders.
Yeah.
When I look at football, sometimes I think, oh, I sort of try to assess it in my head just on a very qualitative approach and say, oh, okay, um there seems to be a shortage of world class players in this position or in that position. Um, Now you're saying that the scouts have to sort of fulfill the head coach's approach or what his needs are at the time. So does that essentially create the market or create the supply of world class players that are in existence? Is it down to sort of the scouting system?
I think that's a complicated question to unpick, because I think people talk about the game going in cycles and various things, but certain countries, are maybe known for producing players. But then there's always constantly development. So FIFA Obviously, a huge amount of criticism at different times for various things. Excuse me, but they do invest a lot of money in trying to develop countries around the world. And some obviously are more successful than others, and some there's a lot of developing countries out there and individuals creating academies. I think the world class players come, a lot of their development is taking place before they get to the latter stages of academies, etc., and before they get to the professional game. But there is a huge transition period between, say, 18 and 23, where players need to fulfill that potential. And I think the added pressure, um, and the expectation and the finances, various different things that come along at that latter stage of their development. Um, from a young player into a senior professional, I think the world class players come from those stages. I think that the players' progression at certain stages there's an element of luck in everyone's life,
Mm,
but there can be styles of play that hone in on certain types of player. And I think for a long time, certain teams or countries would favour, get everything's a continuum, but they maybe push more elements of power, and counter-attacking and pressing ability. Sometimes they favour more technical qualities, and ability to manipulate the ball and, in tight situations. I think that it's always a continuum, and you would never have thought, or certain coaches would never have thought of, someone like Lionel Messi or Raheem Sterling or other players playing as false nines, etc. And I think that's where the demand for certain types of players does change as philosophies change in the game.
I think that's a really valid point, and it's also it speaks to how much the game has changed in the UK alone. One of the things that you looked at in your research, or if we go back to machine learning, um, you used it as essentially as a tool to predict the success of um, players in certain positions and where they go in their career. And the algorithm proved to be pretty successful. Um, so before we sort of get into the results, just explain to our audience how this learning algorithm works, and sort of what data did you use to train it up, etc.
Yeah. So I'd say I am very much a generalist, and I've got a working knowledge of neural networks. So I think if there's any experts out there, please don't, throw anything at the recording or anything like that. So I'm not a world eminent professor in the area, but neural networks essentially try and mimic the functionality of our brain. So we learn certain things really well as people, and we can sort of try to classify images and things like that. Like, we can fairly early on as um, youngsters identify different types of animals and colors, etc. We take visual cues and identify certain things. What we typically are not as good at is finding patterns in some very large, complex data sets. Um, and neural networks are an attempt to kind of create that almost trial and error learning process that our brains mimic through our neurons, but in a digital format. And what they look at, and the neural networks I use, so it's a back propagation, it's a multi-layer perceptron back propagation neural network. So it uses supervised learning, where essentially you feed information into it, but you use groups or labels where you actually identify it for the neural network. So, and to avoid overfitting, you give it a group of your sample and say, actually, this output or this thing is label A. We want you to look at the data behind it and see what do you think makes up this. When we give you lots of cases that are A, but also there's B and C, can you try and find some similarities in this really complex data set to identify why this is A?
Hmm.
And then obviously after that, you look at um, trying to give it some different cases that are not from that sample, that fall into category A, B, and C. And again, go, can you fit, understand and um, create an algorithm to assess these cases? And then in good practice, you usually actually go to another stage of like a test stage where you don't tell it what the labels are. And we go like, we're going to feed these to you, the data to you. We want you to tell us, is it group A, B, or C, or whatever your labels are. And that's when you can really truly test whether the algorithm is successful or not. And I think in my research, I was using a reasonable sample for my domain. It's quite small for other studies and other areas, and that's some of the challenges in performance data. There's only so many matches or data points in certain situations until you go to much deeper layers.
And so, what sort of what labels were you feeding it?
Yeah, so I'll admit it's quite a crude grouping system. Essentially, I fed in that whether the players in from one season to the next, whether they predominantly played their playing time in the league that the data came from, the Championship in England, whether they went to the Premier League in the next season, or whether they dropped down to a lower league. And for matters of simplicity, I removed any players in that group who went on loan or went abroad to another league, because there are coefficients. I want to try and keep it. It's a fairly simple study of, in England, we know the Premier League is a level above the Championship. We know the levels in England below the Championship are a lower level. So there was essentially three groups. So not as specific as you might be in a very practical example, but knowing which players are likely to progress to the Premier League is a very powerful
Mm.
very, very powerful tool for teams in the Championship or the Football League, etc., which is where I was working at the time when I started it. And that was kind of the real practical output we were aiming at.
And so you managed to get some results that were really interesting. Now, one of the results that um, is counterintuitive, but it is one that, for me as a former like player and participant in the sport, makes sense. And that result was that strikers, well, a good predictor for strikers isn't necessarily goals.
Yeah, well, I think it's not purely goals, and I think that there is some logic behind that. And I think when you so I've been lucky to work with some very good data scientists who are real specialists in this area. And I think what you find is that goals are not as repeatable or as consistent from one season to the next as you would think. And that's why players like Harry Kane or Aguero or Messi, Ronaldo, the real world's best who do consistently score, on a regular basis, almost a goal a game, or they are incredible outliers. There are not as many strikers out there who can replicate that season after season at the same level. And some of that is um, it's down to the number of opportunities that are presented, but that there are things outside of goals that measure strikers, contribution and success. And I think some of that came through in the research. Also, there was a lot of metrics around regaining possession, interceptions. Basically, essentially regaining the ball in the opposition half, etc. And my level of data is not advanced as it is now that teams have. But that was coming through quite strongly, and a lot of them were attacking positions, which was interesting because pressing was becoming more prevalent, and I think that contribution without possession should never be forgotten. But the data did replicate that and did sort of highlight it as well, which I think was really interesting at the time.
I mean, the machine learning algorithm that sort of gives you this information. Can you then, based on the information that you've extracted, essentially set targets for players in academies and in professional lineups?
I think the thing you've got to understand about performance data, especially in football and a lot of other sports, the context is very important. And I think what excuse me, a good performance at academy level is very different from um, say Premier League or Championship or international football. And I think that's where I see some teams um, probably going down a slightly wrong path, where they'll try and look at an academy player currently and go, well, he's getting X number of passes or penetrative passes or his expected goals or shooting accuracy at a certain level in the academy. That means he is at a Premier League level. And actually, what they need to do is compare that player against players from that age category on a bigger scale to see where they fit in their current pool. And then also, how do they perform when they're competing against those senior players? And that is very difficult until they have done that
Mm,
to measure that. But what you can do is measure them against what's the pool of players at, is if it's under 18s, under 16s, and historically, where do they fit? Because unfortunately, the success rate is extremely low in academy football because the standard is so high to be one of the world's best. You know,
mhm,
unfortunately, we can't all play professional football. We can't even all play in the academy.
mhm,
But the ones who do are typically real outliers because to be a professional, they then need to be one of the best in their age group and their position, probably from the last 10 years, because they're competing with all those players who progressed from an academy over the last 10 or 15 years, probably. And to succeed in that environment, they need to be one of the best at their age group. But there's always room for development. It
mhm,
just depends at what age they're at. And we always see examples where players like Jamie Vardy come really late in their career, but again, players doing that again is probably a bit of an outlier. But it all clicked for him at the right time. He needed the right environment, and certain elements came together. But yeah, I think comparing it to senior players is slightly dangerous, and you just got to be very cautious about that.
mhm. And now that I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with like other sports like the NBA, which is heavily statistics driven.
Yeah.
Um, they give statistics just constantly throughout the game, and there's all sorts of monitoring. Do you think football, professional football, is heading in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because I go to a lot of conferences. I'm really curious. I like to learn from interesting people, and generally, I'm quite happy to admit there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me out there. And I think in some ways, I've kind of taken some of those mantras of like a good coach is a good thief, of looking out for good ideas or good things that I think could cross over or work with other aspects really well. And I think that the NBA for a long time, um, just like baseball, kind of started to embrace the data analytics earlier. They had more access to some of that data on a sporting level in terms of the technical and tactical contribution of the athletes and the players. And it's only recently actually the physical tracking has come into the NBA and some of the other American leagues. So whereas we were the reverse, where we had physical tracking um, from kind of fairly early 2000s at quite a good level, but some of the detailed, more granular, like um, passing metrics, shooting metrics, etc., weren't there, or we weren't using them as much. So the NBA, I think, and you even see people moving on to GMs and being really significant players in their recruitment preparation for the draft. I think clubs in football have, especially in England, have replicated that to some extent, but I think it's a mass thing in the NBA where you're kind of an outlier if you're not using data in a really advanced way. I think in football, it's um, Liverpool have been a big leader in that with a number of other teams, and I think that it's starting to become very noticeable that a lot of teams are hiring heads of data and analysis, but they are genuinely data scientists.
Mhm,
They're high level statisticians, programmers, computer scientists, people who can really extract a lot of data, um, process it, use it, and analyze it in depth to get real, genuine insights. Um, and I think um, that usually trickles down from people who get an advantage from it or people who are the leaders and with the resources. It generally sort of trickles down gradually. And I think
No,
we're sort of at that early stage of that where it's really started to take off through a number of teams.
if we were to compare like a club like Manchester City or let's just say Manchester City, who has you know enormous resources, access to you know any data scientists they might want, and
Mm.
then you compare that with a more sort of modest club in the Championship. The How much of an advantage does does the data and the analytics that a club like Manchester can get access to give them over lesser clubs or less sort of financially affluent clubs?
I think there's there's different parts. So I think for those lower level clubs, um, the challenge isn't necessarily getting the people with those skills, because I think a lot of the tools that um, data scientists can use, a lot of them are open source, like R and Python, etc. There's a lot of um, tools out there where the barrier for them isn't financially in purchasing those tools. It's the actual data that they need to extract the insights from, where there's probably a small but kind of growing number of specialist companies can produce that data, but it comes at a fairly considerable cost. And that is where clubs at a top level really need to decide that they're invested in it. Because I think if they invest in it and decide it's a key part of our strategy, they can get a lot of benefits from it. And even without going that far, I think there's publicly available data where you can actually, just from looking at the appearance data and the minutes and where people are at in a pool, you can actually extract who are some of the more prominent players who are almost ahead of their age curve. Like they're progressing ahead of where they should be, because there's kind of, like, a famous phrase like talent that whispers and talent that shouts. And I think there's some talent that is maybe in unfashionable places and teams, but actually they're performing way above where they should be for their age and where they should be in um, their sort of career path. So a big thing people look at is, the amount of minutes or the appearances for players at a young age. The players who tend to get those elite levels or tend to rise through leagues are maybe playing with peers who are much older than them, but are on a par or showing qualities above some of those players. And it probably means that they're at the wrong level.
Mhm.
If they keep developing and keep, um, dedicating themselves, they're probably going to rise to a higher level. So you can extract a lot of value, um, even at those clubs at a lower level. And I think there are some in the Football League who are really invested in that. So I don't want to give any company secrets away, but
Yeah.
there are some teams who can get as much, if not more, uh, impact from the data, because they can perform at a level higher than other areas in their club.
Mm. That's
Whereas
really,
at Man City, etc., there's probably experts in every area, and the impact is maybe more marginal, but it's still important.
yeah, definitely. And I think it gives this, what you just said gives rise to a really important question, or sort of area, because you have this talent that is people can spot at a young age, and they say, "Oh, this Theo Walcott guy is gonna become the next big thing," and he's gonna become and he doesn't become the next big thing. He has a
Mm.
little burst. That, now I know the data can relative predict success based on sort of appearances and time played and age, etc. Can the data pick out players who might have that edge at a young age, but not necessarily take it any further?
I think that I think that is very difficult. And I think what I'd say as well is anything you do with data, there's no guarantee. There's no sort of easy fixes. And I think that's common sense, that if someone told you I can predict every player who's going to be successful in every league around the world, and completely outperform where they should be or where people expect, I think I'd have to say, that they're selling something that they can't back up. They can't back up those type of promises. I think the identifying players who are maybe not going to fulfill their potential is probably very difficult. And I think that's where I think injury will play a part. And I think we're probably progressing to some extent on the information we can get from wearables, and the screening we can do to assess, well, are there any real genuine physiological um, or kind of genetic issues that will just make you unable to cope with the the physical load of professional football. Because unfortunately, there are some really talented youngsters out there, and I've worked with some in my career where, it's strange cases where I've seen players get some international success early, but actually they were born with a genetic defect where their ACL just wasn't intact. It just never came together,
Oh wow.
and until they get to a certain point, it so I'm not a medical person, but in layman's terms, they have a a physical challenge to be an athlete at that level, where there's a part of their body that's probably going to break down, and you don't know when or if
Mm,
um, it's going to happen next week or next year. But there are players whose bodies just fundamentally are not really designed to cope with the pressure and um, the impacts that happen on a regular basis. And sometimes people just have unfortunate injuries, collision injuries that we can't predict. Um, so I think the short answer is very difficult to say which players might um, overperform at a young age and then burn out. And I think some in that everything needs a collaboration between understanding the person um, and maybe some more objective methods and trying to come together and make decisions. And that's the beauty and the challenge of it. It's not easy, and that's why everyone can't do it. But I
mm.
think that the question that you're asking, I think that is very difficult to answer.
Are there any contingencies for, let's say, for example, we have, I don't know, like a young person who wants to, uh, let me sort of come at it from a different angle. So if we're looking at a player who, um, we want to sort of predict if this kid is going to go on to be success, or we want to sort of analyze his development. The data that we have is, like, for instance, passing, shooting, um, mostly physical based stuff and performance based stuff. How do you extract the mental side of it?
Yeah, I think um, something around the data. I think a way to frame it as well is I think in most scenarios, what you want to do is use it as a development tool as well. And I think that's something I probably embraced and understood a bit better now. I've stepped away from sport and I'm actually working to try and develop young people. Is we all develop at different rates, and people always surprise you. But like you said, some people flourish really quickly, really early on, but their ceiling is just for some reason lower than other people, or they don't reach their max. I think that um, using the tool as a more development tool and identifying and helping them hone their craft or where to potentially focus their time and energy, I think that is um, a really useful way for using data.
Mhm.
And I think for like you mentioned, earlier on, I think just checks and balances a little bit that we're not being biased against anyone for a reason other than their performance. Um, and I think that's something that is really a topic in a lot of areas now, that there are things we're biased against and we generally don't know, or the things people are biased against and people aren't called out for. But I think that with the mental side of it, I think that's an element of, and it's something that a lot of sports can improve on, is what supports in place to help develop the mind as well as the body.
Mm.
And I'm not a sports psychologist, but we all know that a huge part of performance and being able to perform at your best is you feeling confident, you feeling supported, you're in a good environment that's really believes in you and is helping you every day. So I think that is down to real specialist staff being on hand to involve that in every discussion and all the training and development time. And it's not purely a mental health issue. It's actually just it's a performance psychology, of how you focus your attention and energies, and how you kind of get yourself in that optimum state, kind of every day. And you've got a kind of real um, focus on your development goals, like short term, medium term, long term, and kind of turning up with the right energy and enthusiasm every day and keeping the fun in it, because that is a huge part as well. Is you need the fun to be there. You need to feel like a 5-year-old every day, basically.
So talk to me about your sort of, your future plans. So you stepped away from the professional side, to do a bit more on the research side and the development. Um, what do you have planned, or what do you sort of wish to explore next?
Yeah, so in my big focus now is really developing other people, and obviously a lot of my time is spent with young people because I came from very much outside the sport and I wasn't um, I wasn't in an academy, I wasn't a player, but I just loved the game, and I just sought out any opportunity I could, and I kind of found a niche for me that blended a bit of the art of the football and the coaching with some technology and data. And I know there's a lot of other young people who want to be involved. So a lot of my focus now at Loughborough is developing and creating opportunities for them. Because I've kind of gone down that path.
Mm.
I've got that network of people. I know what the demands of the environment are, and I've got a network to try and keep as present, and up to date as possible. But also, it's trying to create a bit of transparency about the processes and the structures that are required to make some more informed decisions.
Mm.
So, working with organizations to help either develop them and develop their staff, or also do some research projects to actually get some of that knowledge out there. So, without delving into which player you want to sign this transfer window, or how you're going to prepare for, or how you're going to play in the game this weekend, it's more, well, what's the process? What's the working week look like? So that the development time or the training sessions we deliver can be more applied.
Mhm.
Because I think there's a lot of secrecy for a lot of reasons, but in some other areas in sports science, the preparation is discussed, but the decisions that you make week to week are, that's why you're an expert. But we can replicate some of those processes in academic training or with other staff, and I think that's what my focus is on now at Loughborough. I really genuinely want to develop people that are going to be kind of involved in those next sporting history moments,
Mhm.
because I think that's what Loughborough's about. The mantra is that we create history, and it's because people from Loughborough in sport have been involved in a lot of those magic moments we've seen on TV or experienced or been a fan of. They had an element either on the pitch themselves or they're actually behind the scenes supporting people kind of reach their goals and their objectives.
Mhm. What kind of advice would you give to, let's say, a young person who, or young or kid in sort of still in school, who has all these dreams, might be already starting to get recognized for their skills and their ability, um with the advances in technology and sort of your experience in having been in that environment. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think the the one thing I'd say is hard work is absolutely vital. There's a level of dedication and pressure involved in elite sport, so you need to kind of embrace that. But there are so many tools and resources online now that uh, you can learn an awful lot before you get to elite sport. And I think what you need to do is look at if specific types of jobs or roles you want or you're interested in, is how can you either watch content from people who are in those opportunities at the moment, what kind of job descriptions and adverts go out there, so what things do they look for, what things keep coming up and cropping up that you need. Some of those are um, soft skills, or they're skills that they're more person to person, or they're not the technical skills. But try and separate them into categories and look at, well, what have I currently got, and be very honest. I speak to a lot of young people, and I was probably exactly the same. I didn't realize the level of communication or the detail in communicating and collaborating with people under pressure, from different departments, making decisions under real heightened pressure. So some of those skills I think you can hone in academic settings. I think some of them you generally need to get yourself into the coal face and try and um, throw yourself into opportunities and get your hands dirty.
Mhm.
It's the unpredictable parts of life, I think, where we learn from, and sometimes it's actually failing at things. So you need to get comfortable being under pressure, maybe being a little bit out of your comfort zone. And I think it's going and seeking out those experiences and mapping where you're at now to what people seem to want, and are looking for. And I think that's the way by going and getting those experiences and really pushing yourself, um, and probably not listen to that fear in the back of your mind, just going out there and getting experience. I think that's where you'll learn a lot.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic advice. Where can people find you online?
Yep. So I'm on Twitter, so at DB Analysis, And obviously, the Loughborough University website, my staff profile's on there, and my email address, etc. I think if people are interested in analysis, I'm always interested in talking to new people. And I am very busy, but I like chatting to people from different sports, different countries, different age ranges. It's just, I genuinely do want to help other people, and I do want to kind of bring people together. And I think Loughborough's a place we can do that and try and raise performance analysis and sports analytics with others. So, hopefully I get some interesting conversations off the back of this as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you definitely will, and there is a lot of interest in it. So I truly appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to me, and I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
No, it's a pleasure anytime, Hussein.
Uh,
So I think it's a great podcast, and thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you so much. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.